Gracious and loving God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable unto you, my God, my strength, and my Redeemer. Amen. So this summer, we are exploring some of the lesser-known characters in the Bible. You know, they all had an impact. Every one of them had an impact on the major characters, the ones whose names just come right to our lips. The ones we call heroes. Now, last week, we heard about Ham and Japheth and Shem, Noah's sons. And today we want to talk about Boaz. Boaz, who married Ruth. Ruth and Boaz, who were ancestors of King David. Who was the ancestor of whom? Jesus. See? It all works, right? Now you remember the story. Well, some of you remember the story. The story is Naomi and her husbands and sons moved away from Jerusalem because there was a famine. There was a drought. And they moved to Moab. And her sons grew up and they got married. And then both her husband and her sons died. That left Naomi with her daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. And they were alone. So, Ruth and Naomi returned to Jerusalem. Basically, Naomi wanted to go home, and Ruth came along. Now, in Jerusalem was this guy named Boaz who lived there, and he seems to have been a fairly prominent individual in the community. He was what my mother would have called a shirt-tail relative of Naomi. Not sure exactly how we're related, but we know that we are. And he was probably not close enough to have responsibility for her in the law. That is, he would not have had to take her into his house and support her. Still, it appears that Boaz was a responsible member of the community. He allowed women to glean from his fields. Now, you know, today that doesn't sound like a big deal, right? Yeah, you can go pick the grains of wheat up. Who wants to do that? But traditionally, the harvesters would cut the wheat and leave what fell on the ground for the poor. So if there were stalks of wheat that fell to the ground when they gathered them up in their bundles, they would leave them. And the women would come with their baskets and pick up all of the stalks and sometimes the individual grains so that they could make sleeping pallets from the straw and bread from the wheat. So this is what Ruth was doing. When Boaz spotted her, and he said to her, Ruth, you can glean all you want. And you can even take water from the workmen's water bottles. And then he said to the workmen, leave her alone. Now, perhaps that's because unattached women, especially a foreigner, especially a foreigner, and you remember, Ruth was a Moabite, a woman without a husband or family could be considered fair game. Fair game. Now, we could assume that Boaz was an all-around good guy, you know? And he would do the same for any newcomer into his fields. Or perhaps we could infer that he was attracted to Ruth and was considering courting her. You know, it doesn't matter. Either way, she was protected in his fields. Now, Ruth, on the other hand, needed to find a way to make a more stable place for herself and for Naomi. And the only really viable choice was for her to marry. And since she had no male relatives to contract a marriage for her, because that's the way it was done, she had to find another way. So, after the harvest festival, when Boaz was drunk and sleeping in the harvest shed, yeah, sleeping is a good word. Yeah. Ruth went and lay with him. Now, the King James Version of the Bible uses an interesting euphemism. It says that Ruth uncovered his feet. Now, it wasn't that he had blankets over his toes, okay? It had to do with moving his robe. Okay. Presumably, what this says is that she seduced him. She seduced him. Yeah. Now, at this point, Boaz could have done a couple of things, right? He could have chalked it up to luck and just moved on, right? He didn't. He could have taken Ruth as a concubine. He didn't. He could have continued to, let's see, how can I say this? Have relations with her on an informal basis. He didn't. He could have denounced her to the authorities. He didn't. He was an honorable man. And he married her. Hence, Obed, the son of Ruth and Boaz, was born. The grandfather of King David was born. Okay. It's an interesting story. And it's kind of a fun one to tell, so it's a good summer story for me. But this story for Naomi is about coming home. Coming home. For Ruth, it's about loyalty and doing what is needed at the time. And for Boaz, it may just be about honor. Being an honorable person. And for us, the story may be all three. It may be all three. You know? We sometimes need to return where we came from. You know? Whether that's a place or a situation. Sometimes we need to go back. Sometimes we need to go back just to make things right. Or we have to go back to a place that just feels familiar. Sometimes we need to stick with people, as Ruth did, even when it would be much easier not to. So, for us, the story is about what we do when we find ourselves in a difficult place. What do you do? Do you stick with the people who have loved you and whom you love? Or do you go running home? Do you reach out to people who are in need, as Boaz did? Or do you ignore them? And make sure you get every bit of grain out of that field. Because it's profit after all. Do you look back at where you came from and maybe return? Or do you say, that's past, I'm not going there again? Either one is valid. What do you do? What do you do? You know, it's about reaching out. You know, we've talked about that a lot. It's about reaching out and doing all we can for people who have helped us. People who have helped us. For Ruth in this story, it's reaching out to Naomi, who helped her. For Naomi, it's reaching out to Ruth and figuring out a way that Ruth can live. And for Boaz, I think it's just reaching out. Just reaching out. Even when it's not convenient. Even when it's not pleasant. And it's about, like Boaz, living with integrity, with honor, with doing what is right, especially when it's not convenient. Especially when it's not convenient. So, who are you? Are you Ruth? Are you Naomi? Are you Boaz? Or more importantly, can you take the best attributes of all three of them? All three of them. Take them on and live them in your life. Give it a try. Amen? Amen.